Good evening and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas Public Talk Series and the 2025 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture, hosted in partnership with the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My name is Professor Nicholas Farrelly. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Southern Tasmania, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this year's Plimsoll Lecture. This evening, we are broadcasting live from Lutruwita, Tasmania. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. The Palawa are the original custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting today in Nipaluna, Hobart. As we gather in this beautiful place and share ideas from one of our country's top international policy thinkers, we reflect on the Palawa people's deep history of storytelling, knowledge sharing, and caring for the land. First Nations peoples were this land's original diplomats and traders, and tonight we pay our respect to elders, past and present, to those who did not make elder status, and to members of the Aboriginal community joining us today. It is now my pleasure to invite the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Tasmania, Professor Rufus Black, to introduce the 2025 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture.
Thank you, Professor Farrelly. Good evening all, and a warm welcome to the 2025 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture. This prestigious annual event is held in partnership with the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It celebrates the legacy of Sir James Plimsoll, the esteemed diplomat and former Governor of Tasmania. Prior to Sir James's appointment as Governor, his remarkable career spanned postings in Washington, Moscow, and the United Nations, and his understanding that the world's most challenging issues cannot be tackled in isolation remains as relevant today as ever. His unwavering belief in the power of connection and dialogue, even in the face of conflict, is a message that resonates deeply in our global context. Tonight, as we gather to honour Sir James's legacy, we are reminded of how relevant his messages are for today. The world faces profound headwinds, from climate change and economic instability to geopolitical shifts and growing inequality. The challenges will require more than just national action. They demand that we work as a global community. And tonight, when we bring together the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and the University of Tasmania, we do it in that spirit of inviting a larger conversation about our most pressing issues. And so it's deeply appropriate to have Professor Medcalf here this evening speaking to our global challenges and Australia's place in it. And as a university at this time, we recognise the challenges the world faces and the importance of universities as places and platforms of free speech, even when chilling winds blow in some parts of the world. It has never been more important to create the place where ideas can be shared and global challenges talked about and possibilities for the future addressed. So in that spirit, we are very fortunate to have Professor Rory Medcalf, AM, FAIIA, with us tonight. As head of the National Security College, the Australian National University, his career spans diplomacy, academia, intelligence analysis, journalism, think tanks, including with the Lowy Institute. Professor Medcalf was a senior strategy analyst with the Office of National Assessments, Australia's peak intelligence agency, and a diplomat with the service in India, Japan, and Papua New Guinea. He has played a lead role in Australia's informal diplomacy with India and a range of other countries. He is recognised globally as a thought leader on the Indo-Pacific as a strategic concept, and in June 2022 was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for his significant contributions to international relations and tertiary education. In 2023, he was appointed a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs for his contributions to understanding the Indo-Pacific. So to deliver the 2025 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture, Australian Resilience and Preparedness in a New World Disorder, please join me in welcoming Professor Rory Medcalf.
Thank you, Professor Black, for that really generous introduction. Thank you for that generous introduction. And I applaud the vision of a university and its role in this contested world. I also join you and Professor Farrelly in acknowledging country. I acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, the traditional and ongoing custodians of Lutruwita, Tasmania. I pay respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. A recognition of its own history without fear and in totality is surely a basic condition for a nation that is reconciled, cohesive, and ready for the future. My thanks to our hosts this evening, to the University of Tasmania, to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The Plimsoll Lecture has become a significant event each year to promote new thinking about Australia in the world, and I'm honoured to deliver it. I'm also mindful that there have been more distinguished speakers, many of them, since this address was inaugurated in 2007. I'm especially pleased to refer to last year's speech by the Foreign Minister, Senator the Honourable Penny Wong. That was a forthright articulation of the government's humanitarian policy and regional statecraft, and it came from a minister who, in my view, combines respectful engagement across our Indo-Pacific region with a core commitment to the interests, the values, and the identity of today's Australia. I also recall the prescient analysis of the state of the world 2 years earlier by friend, mentor, and colleague, Dr. Heather Smith. Now, advancing the national interest should be a team effort. I think you'll hear a bit more from me about that theme this evening. And so I hope my remarks are taken as building upon theirs. Heather Smith's call for a genuine strategy that brings together the economic and security elements of our national interest is not an idea whose time has come. It's an idea whose global polycrisis has held distressingly true, even more so with every new reverberation of Trump shock, where, as American thinker Adam Garfinkel has ruefully noted, these days there is one certainty about US external policy: uncertainty. My own contribution this evening will be to share some thoughts on how Australia needs to make itself more prepared, resilient, and self-aware. And in doing so, I will announce the launch of a new initiative from my own organisation, the ANU National Security College, to provide a resource to our leaders and our representatives, to governments, to parliaments and other institutions around the country in understanding what Australian people actually think about their security. We hope that this project will mark out the communications gap that needs bridging if we are to stand a chance of being a nation ready and able to cope in the new world disorder. In a world where we are seeing self-sabotage in our ally, and yet where the assertiveness of authoritarian powers does not relent, where there is genuine risk of conflict or crisis affecting our interests, where the boundaries between security and economics, the international and the domestic, people and technology, fact and falsehood are all breaking down, and where we may not be sure what shock will arrive next, only that it will. Now, in a conversation earlier this evening, I was confronted with, I guess, the observation, a very fair observation to those of us in the national security community, that talking about national security should not be the encouragement of fear. And the challenge I think we have in this country is to navigate a path between fear on the one hand and complacency on the other. So I guess if there's one thought I want to leave you with in that regard this evening, it is that national self-confidence and public confidence is the path forward. But we do face a grim horizon of risk. And lest that sound too fatalistic, let us not forget that our nation has weathered geopolitical tempests before, as Sir James Plimsoll knew only too well. Now, it's a privilege to reflect on his legacy, a life of service, and to acknowledge those of his family who are with us here this evening. Sir James was a giant of our mid-20th century diplomacy. His was a time when Australia was adapting quickly to the ways of power and influence to shape our future in a global system being made anew after total war. We readily remember him as a Foreign Service leader, the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs in the second half of that turbulent decade, the 1960s. And we remember him as an extraordinary ambassador, prosecuting Australia's interests across many of the most critical diplomatic posts, including some usually seen as a political preserve, the United States, the United Kingdom, but also Japan, India, Belgium, and the European Community, precursor to the EU, the United Nations. He lived and helped forge an early diversification of our foreign relations, foreshadowing precisely what we should be doing right now to hedge against the vicissitudes of America First. The big bilaterals that have a stake in a secure, reliable Australia, countries like Japan and India. The underestimated economic, strategic and technology potential of Europe, the place where our political values to this day are most aligned, and where, by the way, there are now models of resilience and preparedness, countries such as Finland and Sweden, worth our close study. And a multilateral system where we need to do all we can to shore up those now endangered notions of rules and the sovereign equality of nations. Sir James was also our man in Cold War Moscow, in what was then the USSR. So he knew well how to speak with potential and actual adversaries, as well as with friends. That's another habit we need to cultivate today if we are serious about trying to prevent conflict through diplomacy, as well as to deter it through military force. But James Plimsoll applied remarkable energies and talents for his country in other ways too. His story is a reminder that Australia is at its most effective when our people, like our policies, are creatively whole of government, even whole of nation in their outlook. Volunteering for the military in the Second World War. Service with a unique institution, the Directorate of Research and Civil Affairs. Now, this was the ultimate think and do tank, a wartime greenhouse for intellectuals to lead in disruptive policy thinking and nation building. Indeed, I suspect that the national mission of my own university, the Australian National University, was one of the brave ideas incubated there. And the Directorate drove engagement with our Pacific neighbours, especially Papua New Guinea. That then led Jim to carry forward what we would now rather blandly call capacity building with the Australian School of Public Administration, or Pacific Administration, I should say. That led him to carry forward capacity building, as we would blandly call it nowadays, with the Australian School of Pacific Administration, developing new generations of teachers and administrators to help the Pacific make its own future. Now, I will here indulge in claiming a modest degree of separation, or indeed connection, with Sir James Plimsoll, in which a small but memorable part of my childhood was spent visiting the decrepit wooden buildings at Sydney's Middle Head, where Sir James once trod. Because my own father, who recently passed away, was an educator with that school's successor organisation, the International Training Institute, and along with my late mother, devoted much of his life to education in PNG. I don't need to remind an audience at a university how foolish it would be if our nation were to let education slip as a priority. That is, education both for our own intergenerational national interest strategy, building the skills and the adaptability of Australians, including our own national security workforce, but also education as a singular contribution and a great advantage for Australia in exerting positive influence in our region. Indeed, if we could just imagine new money for foreign policy right now, we should direct it towards a radical uplift of education of Southeast Asia's emerging elites here in Australia. Among other things, that would help remind our universities of their own role in our national statecraft. And if we don't do it, China will. And since we can't do it all ourselves, why not consider an education alliance with competitors in this space, with Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Europe, Japan, perhaps even leaving space for the United States when it recovers its wits. But back to Sir James. His example of whole-of-nation service went even further still. An economist with the Bank of New South Wales, an influential civilian mission with the United Nations inside war-torn Korea. And at the end, of course, vice-regal service to our federation as governor of this state. So in total, his life and vocation speak to themes recapitulating in this new global dissonance, issues alive in the 2020s. Profound questions of war and peace, reconstruction and order, of how Australia must make its own way in an unforgiving world, of the breadth of partnerships we should cultivate in our region and globally, of the practical work that must underpin statecraft, and of why strategy and policy need to connect with the people of Australia, about which I'll have more to say in just a moment. What all of these subjects have in common is the scale of their horizons. James Plimsoll recognised that to secure Australia's future in the world, we need to be fully engaged with it, involved in humankind, recognising that no nation is an island, no island is an island, even when it comes to it, no island off the coast of another island. Every nation is part of the main. Now, strategy can be an overused word in government. It means more than just a new document or an articulation of hope, but there was an unquestionably strategic cast to Sir James's worldview. What are our interests? What are the challenges we face? What are our capabilities? What can we do with what we have? How can we generate more from a situation than at first glance complacent, superficial, blinkered, perhaps fearful, might suggest? And that brings me to the heart of my own message here this evening. As Australia confronts the stark geopolitical realities of our time, wide horizons all right, but horizons crowded with the black swans of risk and surprise, we need a new national mindset. A mindset that recognises that we cannot magically hide from the woes of the world. Geography is not the barrier it used to be. A mindset that recognises that preparing for shocks is an essential part of deterring them and of withstanding them if they occur. Our nation needs a contemporary strategic mindset informed by risk, resilience, and responsibility. Now, at this point, in a lecture like this, it's normal to remind the audiences of those risks facing our nation, with a slightly fresh recital of the list of perils that we all know, and maybe a sad search for synonyms of words like China, climate, conflict, terrorism, turmoil, Trump. The problem is that these days the list can sound so familiar that the audience can be forgiven for treating it as background noise, as if naming our problems is a ritual that will make them go away, or as if deep down we don't think there's much we can do, except hope that we can hang on to the good things of life in Australia, and yes, life here in beautiful Tasmania for as long as possible. Because despite all of the problems and insecurity that our society faces, and with apologies to all who are doing it tough, and for all the understandable reasons why the last election has just seen a search for safety in the government we know, these are actually still relatively good times for many in Australia. But what's next? Few of these issues, however, seemed front of mind in the election campaign just past. Yet Australia, as with other democracies around the world, is facing an accumulation of hazards, strategic threats, involving the use of armed force and other dimensions of state power for coercion and for leverage are overlapping with transnational risks. Global connectedness, disruptive technologies such as artificial intelligence are eroding those boundaries I've spoken of between the international and the domestic, economics and security, even between people and technology. For Australia, the risk register is long. It includes the impacts of climate change, intense natural disasters, pandemics, China's military weight and its willingness to use economic coercion and foreign interference. And there's foreign interference from other countries too. There's terrorism, extremism, disinformation, conspiracy theories, distrust in democratic institutions, the impact of Middle East conflict and other conflicts on social cohesion. It's unlikely we've seen the last of war between India and Pakistan. Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues to profoundly shake the global order, with North Koreans as cannon fodder in Europe and China as the enabler of Russia's war economy. Crude, horrible and bewildering as it may seem for us, in Moscow, the idea of military conquest and war as the whole point of a regime is now a thing again. And casting shadow over all of this are uncertainties about American policy. Those Washington-centric concerns for us are not only about trade. At least Europe now knows where it stands in Trump's world and how it must look to its own security. We may be surprised at how much the Europeans, or at least some European nations, are getting their act together. Already, there are parts of Europe much more resilient than we are. And on this side of the world, we're still waiting for a definitive signal of American policy in the Indo-Pacific on balancing Chinese power and engaging allies. War or brink of war crises in our region, for instance, across the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea, these are highly plausible possibilities here in the Indo-Pacific. And these would have devastating economic, humanitarian and societal consequences for us, even if Australia was not somehow a direct belligerent. We would feel it almost instantly in supply chains, in daily life, in the fabric of our society, no matter which way the conflict would play out. Enough. You get the point. There's a world of risk that our election campaign politely obscured. But we can no longer afford to move cautiously or quietly as a nation in building preparedness against strategic shocks. In my view, a re-elected government, secure in its mandate and confident now with the levers of statecraft, has the opportunity for a frank conversation with the public about the challenges that we face. A whole-of-nation approach to resilience would fit well with the idea of progressive patriotism. This provides an Australian logic for social and economic policy, but there's no reason that it cannot or should not apply to security and resilience too. After all, the very concept of national security in the 20th century, just as the state works with citizens to provide freedom from fear, freedom from military threat, evolved from the social security, freedom from want of the Franklin Roosevelt administration. There's practical and creative work ahead in defining an authentically Australian approach to the problem of security in the 21st century. With a Labor majority government and the extraordinary realignments underway across our political spectrum, with the world in crisis or close to it, it's actually hard to imagine a more suitable time when a leadership will be placed to begin pursuing community trust towards a more unified effort at national resilience. Now, I'm not here to venture every specific recommendation on how a more inclusive national interest strategy would work in the service of making the nation prepared or resilient against the shocks to come. What are the roles and responsibilities of states and territories, of industry, of civil society, of unions, of communities, individuals, indeed of parliamentarians? All of that needs deep engagement and debate. But there is a starting point, and that's a national conversation. Now, to be fair, we have come some way as a nation in transparency and the willingness of government leaders to let the people know what our officials get up to in our name, in your name, and why. And in fact, James Plimsoll played his part. So let us stray for a moment back into the rarefied bureaucratic and diplomatic atmosphere of Canberra in the 1960s, where I suspect the typical external affairs officer did not see it as his job, and in those days it was his job, to have much to do with regular Australians. Plimsoll changed that. Now, to quote Alan Watt's 1967 History of Australian Foreign Policy with its deliciously dated turn of phrase, an encouraging feature of the current official scene has been growing evidence, particularly since the appointment of Sir James Plimsoll, the Secretary, Department of External Affairs, of an increasing realisation by the department of its public relations responsibilities. There now appears to be a stronger trend for senior officers to participate to some extent in non-official conferences and seminar discussion groups. This is a valuable development because while officials do not and would not be expected to reveal state secrets, the information available to them makes it possible for them to influence the views of others which are not soundly based. We may laugh a little at this archaic certainty that surely the special wisdom of a well-chosen Foreign Service officer would sway any argument with those whose views are not soundly based. But the bottom line is that Sir James Plimsoll, was an early mover in recognising the need for our officials to engage directly with the people. As we would say these days, he was risk tolerant. And I'm not entirely sure that the openness of our policy conversations has progressed all that far in the 6 decades since, at least not when it comes to national security. And so, in our own small way, I'm very pleased to announce this evening that the ANU National Security College will contribute to the conversation the nation has to have. This week in Tasmania, we have commenced a major initiative of community consultations, a chance to help illuminate what Australians actually think when it comes to their national security. And I have to say that Tasmanians have responded admirably with ideas and concerns and a spirit of candour and resilience. Throughout 2025, our consultation team, and I have a few colleagues with me here this evening, will visit each state and territory, covering major cities, plus a range of regional centres, rural areas and remote communities. We will convene meetings and seek written submissions, building on a reputable body of survey data by the Social Research Centre. This first of its kind study will then inform a published report towards the end of this year, intended as a resource for governments, parliaments and communities. This in turn will inform the future work of our college through national security education, dialogue, research, contestability and public awareness. Indeed, early next year we will convene a major national conference, Securing Our Future, the second such conference, but the first time it will be informed by data about what Australians think. And that will be a chance for us to again drive national conversation. So I see this as a genuine chance for Australians beyond Canberra to have their say. Tonight, I'm delighted to say we are publishing an issues paper to promote the conversation, calling for submissions between now and the end of August. That issues paper will be available on the website of my college, but we'll promote it through many channels, and I may ask our friends at the University of Tasmania to share it with all of you. Your engagement, Australian citizens' engagement in our consultations can make a difference, in my view, helping prepare the nation for the challenges of today and tomorrow. Because in the complex and uncertain world I've spoken about this evening, security risks are many. They can threaten life and freedoms, but also well-being, prosperity, sovereignty, social cohesion, institutions, and the environment. Governments recognise security as a vital responsibility, yet what security actually means and what to do about it is rarely straightforward. In our consultations, we want to learn what security means to you. We're also interested in finding out what matters most to you when you think about the nation's future, and frankly, whether those priorities do or don't connect with security. Identifying how people and communities think about their own roles and responsibilities will, in my view, help ensure that our nation is prepared for shocks and can withstand them when they occur. It's time to talk and time to listen. Now, this is a long way from Jim Plim's early endeavours with that free-thinking national security brains trust in those old huts on Middle Head, but I'd like to think that he would approve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Medcalf, for sharing such a passionate and insightful and well-argued account of our national situation and the sorts of questions that you and your colleagues at the National Security College in Canberra are grappling with. I think all of us here in Hobart this evening have benefited immensely from this contribution to our local, national and global discussion. Please join me again in thanking Rory for that superb Plimsoll lecture. I can see our microphones have moved into position, and I can see that our first question will come from the first row, please. And if you could briefly identify yourself and state your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Marcus Howard, President of the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Institute of National Affairs. Professor Medcalf, your call to arms for a national conversation is, I think, really timely. As a member of a civil society organisation and a former employee of a university, you mentioned the need for these bodies to be engaged. How do we actually capture the spirit of your call to arms without dissipating it into acrimony and discussion and debate?
Great question, Marcus. Can we take three? Because I have an answer, but I want to kind of weave it in with a few other thoughts because it's too tempting otherwise to get stuck in certain detail.
Okay. Thanks, Rory. Let's go to our second question then, please. Thank you.
I'm a retired academic. I'm also a member of the AIIA for that matter. I rather like the idea of a national conversation. I actually rather like the idea of debate. I'm a retired philosopher. What worries me is whether Australians, even educated Australians with soundly based views, are up for such a conversation. What strikes you as the major impediment to having your desire for such a conversation actually happen and actually produce stuff?
Great. Thank you for the second question. And now we'll take one more, please. Great. Thank you. And a question in the back row. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm Rob Hoddle, Deputy Director of the Tasmanian Policy Exchange here at the university. There's a bit of discussion at the moment about Australia moving beyond the kind of constraining label of seeing itself as a middle power. I was wondering if you can comment on how we might be able to kind of grow up and move beyond that, what that might look like.
Terrific. Thanks for the three questions. Rory, over to you.
That's great. I'll kind of work backwards from middle powers to impediments to avoiding acrimony. So look, those of us who've worked and lived in this space of international relations and statecraft and foreign policy for a while tend to get a little bit stuck sometimes on terminology, and we have to constantly scratch ourselves and remind ourselves, what do the words actually mean? Now, middle power, I think I used it once or twice this evening. It's a handy turn of phrase. I think it does have a legitimate meaning, but we have to be questioning whether it's making us feel empowered, having agency in the world or not. I guess, I don't want to turn this into a sort of strategic studies, international relations lecture. There's probably been a few of those in this hall over the years, but, I see middle power as a country that has significant capacity to protect and advance its own interests, but is not particularly capable or skilled at bullying others. Now, that may or may not necessarily hold true throughout the whole arc of Australian history, but I think it's a good description of where we are now. And yes, you can say there are some very small countries in the Pacific we could really push around if we wanted to, but that would be obviously stupid and counterproductive and against our interests as well as our values. So, I don't see that as a serious sort of proposition. But we are a country that has to make its way in the world, not through sheer power or weight, which is why the damage to the international order that we're seeing, or damage or worse, is so bad for our interests. because we're a country that rules and laws and predictability have suited immensely over the years, and it just happens to be consistent with our values. So I'm not in a hurry for finding new labels. Former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop used to like calling us a sort of a top 20 country, which has a certain ring to it because we are around the 13th largest of everything in the world, economy, military budget, and so forth, except when it comes, of course, to our massive territory. And if you start expanding that to look at our Antarctic territory as well, which I know a few in this room do, we become actually a very big power. But capability-wise, we're going to remain somewhere below the great powers. So I'm not too worried about the terminological problem, as long as we're self-aware. On the other two issues of impediments and acrimony, look, I don't see enormous impediments to having something of a more robust and inclusive public conversation on national interest and national security than we have at the moment, because we're coming up from a very long way down, and anything is an improvement on where we are at the moment. I'm certainly not going to, express views on the relative capability and competence of Australians from different walks of life. We are actually relatively a highly educated nation. We do have enormous diversity of perspectives, many of which we don't hear very often. I think part of the challenge for the work that we're conducting here is to ensure that the national consultations are not simply self-selecting groups of people who are already interested in this stuff, because that's very easy to muster. So we're going to work very actively with a very eminent panel of advisors, including people like Jennifer Westacott, for example, formerly of the Business Council of Australia, but also Chancellor of the University of Western Sydney, to help reach parts of the community who don't normally express views on these issues. So yeah, we'll look for the impediments, but I think we'll make reasonable progress. I think the bigger impediment has been a caution on the part of not only government, but some other parts of the political class to actually encourage the conversation. And that's why I was, I guess, a bit disappointed in the way major political parties approached it at the election. But I should add, when we engage with parliamentarians behind closed doors on national security, they are very forthright and generous with their views and assessments. So I have a lot of hope that creating a bit more license for the political class to engage will enrich the conversation very quickly. On the question of acrimony, I kind of think I know where you're going there, Marcus, and I do think, unfortunately, that in the Australian national security, foreign policy, strategic studies, international relations debate, particularly over the past 10 years, and Nick, you may have seen a little bit of this in your time, there has been a tendency to personalise the issue. The so-called Australian Twitter sphere was notorious at one point, not many years ago, on, for example, the China debate, people taking sides and, calling each other nasty things. That's obviously immensely unhealthy and counterproductive. My view is certainly the work we're pursuing with our community consultations, it's all about the issues, it's all about the substance. And the last thing I think that would be productive would be to personalise it. So, I'm reasonably comfortable that we can take a grown-up approach.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Rory. And as the audience here in the Stanley Burbury Theatre in Hobart has been listening to you in person, our large online audience has also been offering their thoughts and responses and what's now a rapidly growing and long list of questions. So what we might do while we are considering further input from here in the room, I'm just going to raise a few of the key themes that are emerging online. And I'll start with a question. We have an anonymous attendee who would like to know, how can we strengthen the capacity of young Australians and Tasmanians to engage meaningfully, in this case with Asia, but I think probably the question also speaks to the broader landscape of international affairs.
That's a hard one. What else have you got?
I must say, Rory, I've only got hard questions.
Okay. I'm going to take that one.
There.
And by the way, I'm very grateful that you are very conveniently conducting our community consultations for us. So thank you. We'll go home with the job done this evening. Now, look, that's fantastic. I think that everything I'm speaking about here, and it certainly isn't national security in that narrow sense of purely, the military side of things or intelligence. It certainly is very much connected with foreign policy, statecraft, our engagement with the region. This is all about the future, and it is all about the role of younger Australians. So certainly some of the work we're doing is direct engagement with next generation Australians. I had a very good conversation yesterday with a number of students here in Hobart, and their questions and observations gave me huge hope that we're working with people here who are going to be very, very strong contributors in the future. I think we can't limit this to a lot of the existing programs that there are for younger Australians to engage with the region. I mean, the new Colombo plan is a good thing. It's been around for a number of years, but we can't afford to be complacent about imagining that it is achieving all of the goals it's intended to do. We have other opportunities, often, to be honest, here on Australian soil. So, I think the more that we can ensure that young Australians are engaging across communities in this very diverse and multicultural Australia, the better. Because in fact, often a lot of the expertise about the region is already in Australia, and it's all often in first and second generation migrant communities. So I think, organisations, I'm thinking, for example, of some of the youth dialogues that I've seen established quite spontaneously by students over the years. There's an Australia-India youth dialogue, an Australia-China youth dialogue. There are youth dialogues with countries in Southeast Asia. Find out about those, engage with those. If you don't know, ask, because I think there are plenty of opportunities now to be part of a regional conversation on Australian soil, and then use that as a way of expanding into the region. I will just sort of give a plug for one more student-led activity, which is a national activity, and there's certainly opportunity for Tasmanian students to engage in that. And that's what's called the Australian Crisis Simulation Summit, which is a student-led activity based at ANU, but very much with a national cohort of participants each year. A group of students who some years ago came to me with a great idea to conduct very sophisticated simulations of how the nation would cope with crises. And I had the folly and the dishonour of doubting that they would get it done, and said, look, come back in 6 months and we'll talk about it then. That has gone on to be a resounding success year after year, with new generations of students running it, and they make a call for expressions of interest around the country each year, and I'm confident that students from Tasmania can and do take part in that. And a lot of the crises they look at are not simply the kind of military issues, but things like, natural disasters in the region, issues to do with cybersecurity, sort of real things affecting real communities.
There's a huge amount of interest, Rory, right here in our online room in the consultation process and the work that you and your teams are doing. I'll just read out 2 of the questions related to this, and then we'll come back here for further questions from the audience. So a first question here is, in what ways are you enabling engagement with rural or remote areas? Say in Tasmania, the person asking the question is a concerned citizen living in such an area. And then another question from an anonymous attendee: have you considered groups such as people with disability in the community consultations? Broadly, how are you going about ensuring that this isn't, as somebody else in the room has contributed, just the usual suspects talking to each other?
No, great questions. And look, I'm partly inspired by some community consultations I took part in about 11 years ago, where I was involved in a process of consultations for a defence white paper, a very good exercise, both the white paper and the consultations, but we didn't do it well enough. And so colleagues, and I was one of a panel of independent advisors that conducted consultations around the country, colleagues that took part in that found that there was a little bit too much of the self-selecting. I mean, I have absolutely nothing against retired colonels. I think they're fantastic. They contribute a lot to the nation, but if that's the only audience you're engaging on the future of security and defence policy, then you're going to get certain answers. I mean, maybe retired sort of naval commodores might have given us a different answer. But anyway, so absolutely, you've got to select and push for diversity. Now, my colleagues who are in the room listening intently and have done a lot of the work in crafting the consultations, and we have other colleagues at the college who will be involved in this over the course of the year, are working very hard to actively reach out to communities and groups to encourage and engage them, often working through intermediaries. And that could range from, for example, from members of parliament who can identify who in their constituencies we should engage with, but it will also involve reaching through civil society organisations. So at the moment, I have to say a lot of the focus has been on cultural diversity. And so cultural diversity or diversity of location, we've got ethics permission, for example, to extend the consultations into First Nations communities. And that, that is a really big deal in terms of university ethics approval, because that obviously requires a very certain degree of respect and sensitivity. So I'll take on board the point about people with disabilities, and I'll make sure that that gets fed into the work that has only just begun. I mean, we've literally commenced with, I think, about 20 or 30 meetings this week in Tasmania. We're putting up a call for submissions online, putting out an issues paper, but we will have the opportunity not only to try and re-engage with parts of the country that we've visited already, but also to conduct virtual engagement as well. And I should note that I think colleagues in the room here conducting the consultations this week have been to a few really interesting and important parts of Tasmania that we don't always get to. So I think, for example, the northwest was Burnie and at around there was one of their first ports of call.
Yeah, terrific. It's great to hear. Thanks, Rory. So I'd like to come back now into the room, and we've got our microphones moving around, and we might start right at the back. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sahana. As you've already mentioned, thank you for the lecture. And as you've already mentioned, compared to Sir Plimsoll's time, we are a far more diverse population with cultural diversity. How will this play out in the consultations, especially if you're trying to come up with a cohesive collective strategy with so many of our citizens coming from such different contexts? But also, how do we also plan for inter-ethnic and intergroup tensions in the consultations?
Thank you. Next question, please. Yes, we'll go over here. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Medcalf, Peter Hodge is my name, the Royal United Services Institute. We are planning a resilience seminar in Hobart in the first half of next year. The current state resilience plan is about fire, flood, and a major shooting incident. For us to contribute to your conversation, what else should we consider?
Great. Thank you for the second question. And now we will come back here for our third question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin Henscher. I work at the Menzies Institute for Medical Research, but this is not a medical research question at all. I really appreciate your focus on the community engagement and understanding what Australians think. Maybe could I ask you to turn the telescope round the other way? What confidence can you give us as citizens that the kind of national security leadership, particularly intelligence and military top leaders, are not theoretically, but really maybe viscerally able to engage with very different alliances and or the change status of alliances, etc. How well are they coping with this change situation?
Terrific. Thanks for the three questions. Rory, over to you.
Great. Now, and that they all have their own sensitivities, those questions. Thank you. Look, on the intergroup question and the question of really cohesion within a very diverse society, I guess that is one of the starting points for wanting to have the consultations. I think that there was a time where the policymaking community and the political community could make some pretty good estimates of what they would consider to be, the public appetite or tolerance level for certain policies in national security and the national interest. One of the great strengths of Australia over recent decades is diversity. But there is also a challenge there because we now have more Australians from more backgrounds living in more parts of the country with very different life experiences than ever before. And that extends to culture and heritage and identification in some cases with different sides in different conflicts in other parts of the world, or with different groups that are vulnerable in conflicts in other parts of the world. is, I think, an enormous strength of the country that we have this diversity and this pool of expertise and perspectives. But it's only going to work if there's a very clear picture and a very clear understanding. And if in particular, I think there's an active effort to identify commonalities as well as points of difference. So, without preempting anything we're going to find in the work that we're doing, I would anticipate that some of our findings and data will point to a fragmentation of perspectives. Other points will point to some commonalities. There are all sorts of very fundamental things, peaceful and safe communities, for example, that people value and cherish regardless of their background. And so if we can help to illuminate for policymakers where the opportunities for convergence and commonality are, and help point to, I guess, data that parliaments can use to encourage conversations in a more unifying direction, then I think we'll achieve something. In terms of managing the conversations themselves, and again, preempting a little bit of what my colleagues are doing, but we're not planning to do this as a kind of set of, free-for-all town hall conversations, because there's always the risk there of the loudest voice getting the hearing, and there's also certainly the risk of differences coming into play in a very overt way. We are trying to approach this from a much more sensitive point of view, and so it's much more labour intensive. Lots of small group conversations or even individual conversations and written submissions. Let's see how we go, but we certainly, the last thing we want to do is actually aggravate tensions within the community. The point about resilience and what are the other shocks to think about, and I'm really and I'm really appreciative that Rusi's doing this thing. I'm assuming that there's a lot of thought in this part of Australia about issues like security of supply chains, for example, security of supply lines, the points that I made earlier about crises happening elsewhere in the world having pretty immediate economic repercussions. I read a rather disturbing headline today, sorry to throw something negative into the conversation, but a rather disturbing headline that pointed out that effectively, if global shipping were to shut down, the global economy would collapse in 3 months. Now, 3 months is actually quite a long time, but it's not long enough to re-engineer your infrastructure or an indefinite period of genuine economic self-reliance. So I think creatively about those other shocks, cyber shocks to critical infrastructure and so forth. But the spirit of those exercises and the spirit of what we're doing at the college is certainly not to say, well, we'll all be ruined. There are all these sort of vectors of doom and crisis. It's also to point out that we have enormous stocks of potential resilience in this country, something I probably didn't articulate enough in my speech there, and we only use a fraction of it for the national interest. So I think one of the things I'm inspired by is countries and places where there's a much clearer sense of what are the responsibilities of citizens and the responsibilities of communities to coordinate and contribute to the national interest or the community interest. And I still think there's an enormous reservoir there that we haven't entirely tapped. The third question about alliances and alignments and what are the deep dark secrets of our national security community? Obviously, even for someone like me who works at the edge of the national security community rather than within it, there are all sorts of sensitive questions. So, for example, where are we going to go with the alliance with the United States? My own view on that is, as I've said in my speech this evening, there is deep uncertainty, but it would be madness, in my view, for Australia to proactively walk away from the relationship because the United States is deeply divided on all of the issues we've spoken about tonight, and it's not over. So, I think in many ways being very clear-eyed and pragmatic and obviously working the relationship in an interest basis as well as we can for the time being, but also beginning to strengthen more of the self-reliant side of our capabilities and to demonstrate to that alliance what we bring to it, from the point of view of their interests, I think is a pretty wise way to proceed. But at the same time, to be much more active in cultivating the other relationships that I spoke about. And I think within the community of security agencies and assessments agencies and policy agencies and all of that, actually quite deep architecture that we've got in Canberra and around the country, I can assure you there are large numbers of very smart people of goodwill who are thinking about these things. But I guess the challenge is then to distill that advice, to work it through the political leadership, and to have political leadership make some tough choices. And that's the bit that I cannot speak to.
There are plenty more questions, Rory, coming through online. So the first question is, Rory, what is your opinion of Australia possibly adopting a policy of compulsory national service? Yep. Specifically with regard to deterrence, but also around social cohesion. And then the next question in the pair is, what, from your perspective, are some practical ways to increase resilience at this time of such global uncertainty in a peaceful way, and specifically for young people who are against war?
Those are two deeply connected questions. Thank you for both of them. There's always a national service question. And look, in the issues paper that we're putting out this evening and we'll share with you all, there is a paragraph about this towards the end of the paper. So, at one end of the spectrum, there are parts of the world, democracies, particularly in Europe, where national service is kind of a regular, normal thing. It's actually almost a part of being part of society. Yes, it's often involving military national service, but very much in a territorially defensive capacity. And it's even about preparing young people with the skills and the networks for their civilian careers afterwards. Now, that is a very unrealistic model for Australia, certainly at this point in history. The Vietnam War experience, I think, poisoned the idea of military national service in the Australian political debate for, indefinitely. I think, frankly, until the next war. To be honest, if there is a time that Australia is involved in a major power war, that could change. But in peacetime, I would fully respect the fact that national service in that sense is not a political option. However, there's a lot else Australia can do. And I think that if you look at the challenge that we face, for example, we have a very small defence force. I think many of us in the room might know this, but many Australians probably don't realise how small in personnel numbers our defence force is. Every time there's a natural disaster and the defence force is effectively put in there as almost a responder of first resort, not even of last resort, it makes a massive dent in the ability of the Australian Defence Force to respond to the things that it was actually trained for, and the things where it is an indispensable asset, if there were to be any kind of military contingency in the region. But the challenges that it's responding to in those civilian emergencies are challenges that a much larger part of society could contribute to the response to. So, for example, we have very good traditions of volunteering, state emergency services, other local organisations, and even surf lifesaving clubs. There's a wonderful volunteer tradition in Australia. There is, I think, a perception that particularly in the rural fire services, that it's an ageing demographic, that it's not necessarily getting the replacement that it needs. And there are, certainly if you look at voting patterns, lots of idealistic young Australians who care about climate change, the environment, and really being part of a cohesive community. So I think it's not a politically controversial thing, and it's certainly not a politically conservative thing to say there should be models and incentives for much greater coordination of volunteering by young Australians in a organised, structured way to conduct civilian activity. And it's interesting when you look at even some of the more extreme scenarios of crisis. So, for example, if there were to be a warlike scenario, or a scenario where Australia was feeling threatened, not at war, but feeling threatened and needing to divert lots of civilian capability into keeping society functioning, issues like childcare, for example. There are all sorts of basic, and I don't mean that in a at all offensive way to friends that work in childcare, but all sorts of fundamental skills and directions of labour and talent and expertise that have nothing to do with warfighting, and for which people of all ages are actually kind of suited. So I think those are excellent questions, and I think the challenge is to start exploring realistic frameworks for coordination, whether it's in, sort of Green Corps style environmental response or disaster response mechanisms, whether it's in some kind of training in civil preparedness. Australia's a long way behind, but we have a wealth of talent. And I think we have a lot of people who would, with the right program, get interested without ever having to think about lethal force.
I'd love to get a few more questions while we can here in the room. If anybody would like to raise their hand, I've got a couple over here. We might start up the back, please. Thank you.
Dr. Matt Killingsworth, I'm a senior lecturer here at the university. Are these 4 years a blip? I mean, when we're talking about the disorder that we have, but we also noticed in the previous 4 years of the Biden administration, there was a return to what we understood as institutionalism. We had peace through engagement with the United Nations, a re-engagement in the region. I wonder, is this a new normal? Is this a sort of new normal? Do we return to that rules-based order that you spoke for when Gavin Newsom is the next US president, for example, perhaps?
Thanks, Matt. I've got more questions in here, I think. Yes, right in the corner. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Grant, and I have just come straight from a 10-hour shift at the Incat shipyard where I've worked for the last 29 years building boats. I'm very big on manufacturing, have been for a long time. I'm very frustrated in recent times, especially in the last month or two because of the federal election, that local manufacturing has been non-existent right through the whole talk. What can we do to make these politicians realise that making things in Australia is in our national interests? You know, most are good at not just making ships, but most of the people in this room would be on some form of medication that is more than likely not made in Australia. Now, I'm not just talking about making ships, I'm making pharmaceuticals, fuel for our cars, for our defence force. We make nothing. What can we do to make these people in Canberra wake up to realise that this is a great idea?
Great. Thank you for the second question, which also gets a round of applause. And I'll take a third question if I can. Just need to see. Yes.
Oh, my third question is following on from Grant's wonderful intro. I'm Chris Merridew, provider of motor cars to the people of Hobart for many decades. 400 people here tonight. Probably 300 of you have come in fuel-driven motor vehicles, petrol, diesel, as do our farmers rely upon fuel, as do the trucks that bring the food to the supermarkets, as do the aircraft that fly us off on whatever reason. What is the government, or what is your proposal that we do something with a degree of urgency about drilling or retrieving our oil reserves, our gas reserves, and also building more reserves to hold fuel? Currently, we have enough fuel to take us up to about the winter solstice, and then we shall all be walking and starving if the tankers that are coming to Australia should be disrupted, shall we say.
Yeah, we'll take one more question. I think I did see some more hands up as well. Yes, we will come down, please, to the front row.
Thank you. Madeleine Ogilvie, Minister for a range of things, pretty much all of which you've spoken about tonight. So I'm really pleased to see on the agenda cybersecurity, digital and data, communications, Antarctica, climate change. And we here tonight are in the epicenter of learning for those things. And I'm really pleased that you're starting your consultation here. My question is, in our defence posture, I think we look to the north a lot. I've always had a sense that we should also think about our island status here and what's happening behind us in Antarctica. Do you have some views about how best to inject that dialogue into the work that you're doing? I've tried a few times in different forums to get people to focus on the South. I think we would like to be heard on that, particularly around defence.
Thank you, Minister. Back to you, Rory.
Well, again, I'll work backwards and I'll start with Minister's question. And thank you for being here this evening as well, and for welcoming us to Tasmania. Look, the question of where does not only Tasmania, but really I think the sort of southern part of Australia fit in defence policy and in the strategic environment? It's a very fair and good question to raise. I think there's long been a time where with our enormous territory, we've been focused on, the so-called northern approaches to the country. But of course, the funny thing about water is that you can kind of move through it. In fact, the number of people lately who, when I asked them to describe what the Chinese Navy have been up to do this in Australia, suggests that that water is very much about manoeuvre, about getting around. I think that a lot of circumstances and risks that 10, 20 years ago we really struggled to imagine are now beginning to happen. And that doesn't mean, I think I want to emphasise, and I hope it didn't come out in my speech tonight, I'm not one of those occasional voices who say, look, Australia faces a military invasion threat. But to be really frank about it, we didn't actually face a military invasion threat during the Second World War either, but we did face an existential threat as a nation that was going to be sort of completely neutralised in that conflict and subverted. So we have to think creatively about risk, and we have to realise that our geography doesn't protect us in the way that it used to. It's not about necessarily countries, assembling sort of extraordinary armadas or military forces at any point on the globe, but it is about countries projecting reach, sending signals, demonstrating that they can operate with serious force in different parts of our neighbourhood. And that's why, for me, the recent Chinese Naval Task Group was a pretty important inflection point. I actually wonder a little as to what would have happened if it had gone through Bass Strait rather than around. That is how the signal would have been interpreted, because it was perfectly within international law for the PLA Navy to have conducted a transit there. This is not about alarm, but I think it's about a recognition that we have to think about our defence in terms of the whole Australian continent and about our ability to show presence and project. And I think if we were to extend this conversation into the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, or indeed the Southern Ocean, it immediately becomes apparent that Australia's interests are much larger than our capabilities single-handedly, which I think is one reason why we still need to be creative with partnerships and who our partners are. And we also need to be, I think, thinking very hard about the value that we get out of the defence expenditure that we have. Going to the other questions of, I think, manufacturing and supply lines, I think the purpose of the consultations is certainly not to come forth with the answers. And, I think lots of analysts here and elsewhere and in Canberra have very clear views. I think there's been warnings for many, many years now about fuel insecurity in Australia. And it does seem a bit unusual that when some years ago government came up with the idea of building a strategic fuel reserve, they located it in the United States rather than a bit closer to home. So, there is serious work to be done. There are arguments as to the security benefits of distributed energy systems. The energy transition is not purely about the environment. It's also about really about resilience in some ways. And there's going to be no one solution. I mean, there's been lots of creative talk over the years about, certain parts of the transport network becoming more reliant on electricity or diesel or other forms of energy in order to ensure that certain transport fuels are preserved for the strategic purposes they're needed for. But we're not going to sort of get the final answers on all of that tonight. But I think you have identified, I think, one of the key risks for Australia in a strategic crisis elsewhere in the world, and that is those sea lines of communication. The last point about manufacturing, again, I would certainly not posit any easy solutions, and I think there's clearly an argument for preserving some areas of manufacturing in Australia, particularly for materials that have strategic purposes, and certainly whether it's in sort of hardened steels or some forms of shipbuilding or elsewhere. There's certainly a strategic argument for that. The challenge is a flip side argument, of course, which is the economic argument. And I think that one of the challenges I didn't speak about tonight is also the question of ensuring that across the entire economy, we maintain enough levels of productivity that we can ensure the right levels of growth. So I would say, please bring your ideas. We would love to take a submission from you into the process. I think please bring those ideas to us in more depth and more detail. That is precisely the kind of perspective we'd love to hear. And not only in terms of the capability you're talking about, but the location as well. The fact that if Australia concentrates all of its strategic industries in any one or other pocket of the country, we're also making ourselves vulnerable. There's a strong argument for decentralisation there. So thank you.
And then just to wrap up, Rory, we had Dr. Matt Killingsworth's question that
one.
Yeah,
no,
you were going to
dodge the hard one. You can answer that one.
No,
I mean,
that one's for you.
There have been several questions here where I think you would have a better answer than I would. So look, my own assessment of the future of the alliance and I guess the Indo-Pacific strategic order and the global strategic order is certainly that, as I said, we cannot and should not be actively walking away from the United States or even saying some of the things I've said this evening. I think it's wise that our policy leaders are not saying those things up in lights. That's my job, not theirs. And there are certain other voices in the debate who are far more forthright. I mean, if you had, Hugh White or Malcolm Turnbull in the room this evening, that would be interesting. And I mean that respectfully. No acrimony, I promise. But the old rules-based order isn't coming back. I think the rules-based order that we knew, and I don't mind that term rules-based order, it's often sort of parodied and criticised, and of course it's always been a rules and power-based order. It's just that it's now flipped to become a power and rules-based order. We have to shore up what there is. We have to be more active than ever in the multilateral system, in regional institutions. We haven't talked about the regional institutions in Asia, in ASEAN and so forth. We need to be holding all those institutions to account to actually do what it says on the box, which is things like conflict prevention, which they don't usually actually do. But we shouldn't be, I think, pretending that when the United States starts to recover its senses, and I think there's already signs that parts of the American ecosystem are recovering their senses, that it will come back as the US that we knew even during the Biden administration, because so many of those drivers of America First are deeper than simply Donald Trump's instincts. For me, the key question will be to do with US-China policy. So if the United States, in whatever form, remains serious about competing with China, and I didn't talk a lot about my perspectives on China this evening. That could be another whole conversation. And personally, I think the United States should compete with China, and it's in our interest that they do so, as long as it's balanced and stabilising competition, not destabilising competition. But if the United States remain serious about competing with China, then they will remain strategically engaged in this region and they will need Australia. If the United States decides not to compete with China on the world stage, then we are in a completely different world. And that's when I would be having that conversation about, how does Australia completely recast our security? But we're a long way from that yet.
On that note, please join me again in thanking Professor Rory Medcalf. Sadly, we've reached the end of tonight's conversation, and we really appreciate, Rory, your adept handling of such a wide range of questions, and again, for your lecture. I'd now like to introduce Kathleen Plimsoll, the niece of Sir James Plimsoll, to deliver our vote of thanks. Kathleen.
Hello. There are so many people that need to be thanked tonight that you'll just have to bear with me as I thank. First of all, I think that we need to thank the University of Tasmania for putting on such a wonderful series of lectures in the Island of Ideas, because it's one of those series that doesn't just focus on one particular thing, it looks at a wide variety. I'd like to thank the Vice-Chancellor, the Professors Farrelly and Hayward, the Institute of International Affairs, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and particularly the organisers of this event, the people who toil behind the scenes, Belinda Brock and Sarah Golden and their team, who've really put on a tremendous event every year. I think that in being asked to thank Professor Medcalf, I have to read something between the lines, that the subtext of what he's saying is that although we're always living in interesting times, perhaps we're living in just a little bit more interesting times now, that the temperature is going up just slightly. And to cope with that, we have to be very internally resilient and know how we stand as a nation, that we're not necessarily going to be invaded, but if something happens, we need to be prepared, that we're not necessarily going to be asked to go out and fight in a war on the other side of the world, but we need to be prepared for what the impact of that fight on the other side of the world might have on us. One of the things that I was asked to say is to, in some way, tie what Professor Medcalf has said back to my uncle. So all I can say is that in many ways, the issues we're facing today are similar to those that we've always faced. I am personally blessed by having cartons and cartons of printed material, which I have inherited. I have a speech from John Gorton when he was the Minister for Defence in 1969, talking about how Australia was going to fill the gap in Malaysia and Singapore with the British sort of peremptorily leaving. And it was the same sort of thing about diplomacy, about stability, about trying to engage economically and building alliances in the area that Professor Medcalf has talked about today. I also have, and this is, I didn't know that I was going to need this, but public participation in bureaucratic decision-making, a reappraisal. Now, this is from winter 1980. So in the Institute of Public Administration, we've been talking a lot about public participation. Well, now is the time, I think, that we really need to galvanise what we can to make sure that as a nation, we're prepared for all these eventualities that may or may not happen. In conclusion, and as a personal anecdote about my uncle, I'd say he was a very generous man, as well as being the public persona that people have mentioned. That in 1969, I was 9 years old, and he took the time to explain to me, even though I did not adequately understand any of it, the domino theory. And I remember getting up in 5th class with a friend of mine, Martin Hadley, and we were at the blackboard with our chalk, and there we were explaining how the domino theory impacted on Australia. And when you think about it, he was the head of external affairs that year. He didn't need to take the time to tell a 9-year-old what was happening in the world, but he did. So he was always very generous with his knowledge and the benefit of what his knowledge could give us. So in conclusion, I would like to thank Professor Medcalf. I think we got as much out of the questions and answers as we did out of the actual presentation. And if you could all join with me in thanking him tonight.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for that wonderful acknowledgement of Professor Medcalf's contribution tonight. And let me re-emphasise our university's cherished relationship with you, with Anthony and Christian and the rest of your family. And we really do appreciate you joining us once again in honouring Sir James Plimsoll's legacy this evening. This is all we have time for. Recording of the 2025 Plimsoll lecture will now be available as a video and podcast on the Island of Ideas YouTube and SoundCloud channels. You can also head to our Island of Ideas website for further details. And while you're there, you will note that you can register for our next talk in the series, The Promise and Perils of AI. You can attend online or join us here once again in the Stanley Burbury Theatre. That will be next Wednesday, the 28th of May from 6 p.m. For tonight, this is all we have time for. Please join me once again in thanking Professor Rory Medcalf for a superb lecture. Thank you all also for joining us, for being such a wonderful audience, for all of your participation. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2026 for our next Plimsoll lecture. Good evening.